Hello, Sociology. Today we're starting on Unit 2, which is conformity and group dynamics, which is anything having to do with why you follow other people and why groups can be so compelling. So we're going to talk about conformity experiments. There's a few really famous ones we're going to look at and actually watch the video. Some of them are a reenactment, and some of them we're actually going to watch the actual video that was done. And then we'll discuss how that works. A thing called the bystander effect. We're going to look at norms. The first experiment we're going to look at is called the Milgram experiment from the 1960s. Was the original experiment, and it looks like this. There's a doctor in a white lab coat who's administering the experiment. By the way, a lot of this experiment has to do with lying. So this is my doctor. We're going to give him a white lab coat. This is art, trust me. So I don't need to tell you this is not art class, because I'm very proud of my Microsoft Paint skills, but they, well, you can see. But there's three people involved in this experiment. There is a doctor who, by the way, there's a lot of lying that happens in this experiment, which the original experiment was done in the United States, but all the actually redoings, it was done in the 1960s, when the ethics weren't anywhere close to what they are today. So these days, if you go to college and you go to a psychology class in college and you have to do an experiment, which now we're getting kind of sidetracked, but as a freshman, you'll often have to do experiments for the upperclassmen. As part of your credit, you'll have to go to like 2 experiments for the upperclassmen who are doing their experiments in psychology class. But now in American colleges and in most countries, you have to go through very rigorous processes of the ethics review boards to propose and make sure that there's no undue stress caused by your experiment on your subjects and all that. Not so in the 1960s. In the 1960s, you could pretty much do whatever you wanted. There's a lot of animal abuse, human abuse, and this is kind of a case of psychological human abuse, although no physical abuse took place. Anyway, so in this experiment, there's a fake doctor, and then you think, it's a little confusing, so follow me here. There's a doctor who's an actor. He's not a real doctor. Then there's a what's called a confederate, which is just the word used to as an actor. They call them a confederate, an actor that you think is in the experiment but is actually an actor. And then there's you. I'll just call it this actual subject. So the actual subject is there. So you go to this experiment and you think that it's you and the other person that are in this experiment, and you both signed up. You are actually getting paid a teeny bit of money. You signed up, and the experiment is supposedly about learning. Specifically, it's the effect. It is the effect of punishment on learning. So that's, you signed up, and that's what they told you the experiment was about. And you say, sounds good. I just want a little bit of money or college credit or whatever. Sounds as good as any other experiment. Let's go. So here's how the experiment starts. There's a doctor, official-looking doctor in a room, and he says, all right, so to begin this experiment, we're going to draw rolls out of a hat. So he takes this little bowl or a hat or something and has 2 pieces of paper. You draw a piece of paper, and the actor, the fake subject, draws a piece of paper. It's rigged, though, so that you, the subject, always get the role of teacher, and the confederate always gets the role of learner. And that's done by both of the pieces of paper in the bowl actually say teacher on them. So you draw a piece of paper, it of course says teacher. You say, it looks like I got teacher. The confederate draws a piece of paper, and despite it saying teacher, he says, oh, well, looks like I got learner. So he's lying. And here's how the experiment works. Doctor says, all right, so this is going to be an experiment on the effect of punishment on learning. And for the punishment, we've decided to use electric shocks. So we're going to use escalating levels of electric shocks. You're both like, all right, that's kind of weird, but sounds good. And what the doctor says, all right, so since you, since the learner got learner, we're going to take you to a different room. We're going to strap you to an electric shock generating device, And the teacher, which is the actual subject, is going to read you a list of word pairs with A, B, C, D multiple choice answers. Every answer you get correct, we'll move on to the next one. Everything you get wrong, we will shock you. With voltages starting with 15 volts, ranging all the way up to 450 volts. Let me show you the shock generator here. I'm going to move myself to the other side of the screen real quick to let you see this. But here's an image of the shock generator that the teacher has access to. And it looks like this. It's labeled, here's 15 volts on the left side and then 450 volts on the right side. And it's always labeled the same way. On the very left is slight shock when you're around 15 volts, moderate shock, was it 75 volts, strong shock, very strong shock, and then it gets red, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock, and then XXX, implying that giving that shock would be lethal. And you're told we'll start with the 15 volt, and then we'll just move up every one he gets wrong until we get to the. One very important thing that happens in this experiment is that the Confederate is not actually receiving the shocks. He goes to a separate room. You can hear him, but you cannot see him. So when he's getting shocked, he's not actually getting shocked. But you do think he's getting shocked, and you can hear his responses from the shocks. Now, assuming you even start this experiment, by the way, the experiment is not about learning. That's the fake purpose of the experiment. The experiment is actually about whether or not you will, one, start this experiment, this obviously unethical experiment where you're shocking a human, and two, if you will complete the experiment. To start this experiment out, you are given an actual 45 volt shock, and as you'll see in the video, you'll see them get that 45 volt shock. The teacher is given the 45 volt shock. When they receive the shock, it actually hurts. It's a pretty painful shock. And they're asked to guess how many volts that was, and they usually guess a little bit higher, but then the doctor says, no, that was a 45 volt shock. So it impresses on you that it's actually really painful. So you get one of these shocks, you're like, yeah, over here on the left side, that hurts. And it's labeled as lethal here on the right side. A few other things. The learner has said that he has a heart condition, which is kind of a funny twist. So he says, so I have a heart condition, like I have a pacemaker or something. Is that okay? And the doctor says, yeah, it's fine. Don't worry about it. Going back to here, if you begin the experiment, the guy's not actually getting shocks, but you are hearing him respond to the shocks on a pre-recorded sound file that's being played for you. So if you make it to about here, he starts saying, ow. If you make it to about here, he's starting to voice, you'll actually hear this when we watch the experiment. He's starting to say, I don't want to be in this experiment anymore. He says, ow. He starts screaming, ow. Around here, he says, let me out now, that kind of a thing, assuming you've made it that far. Here, he says, my heart's starting to bother me. I don't know if that's in this video, but in the original and one of the other ones I've seen, he says, like, yeah, that pacemaker thing, it's acting up. If you've made it that far. Around the 375 volt mark where it says danger, severe shock, if you've made it this far, he stops responding. So presumably you either killed him or he's unconscious or something like that. And by the way, when you shock him and he's no longer responding, he doesn't give you a response. So if you are still in the experiment and you say, he didn't respond, he appears to be unconscious or dead, the doctor will say, you need to treat the absence of a response as a wrong answer, so you need to keep going. So there are, the way to complete the experiment is to give 3 450 volt labeled lethal shocks to a person that you believe is either unconscious or dead from your shocks. By the way, wall outlets in the United States are 120 volts, so that is somewhere in here. At number 9 or so of 30. Wall outlets in the United Kingdom are 240 volts, I think. They reference that there because this experiment was done in the United Kingdom with a little bit more relaxed experimental ethics boards. And there are 3 ways you can finish this experiment. The first is you don't start the experiment. The doctor says, this will involve electric shocks, and you hear the other guys say, I have a heart condition. You say, yeah, I don't feel comfortable doing this. 1. 2. You stop somewhere in the middle of the experiment. So like when you start saying ow the first time, you tell the doctor, I don't feel comfortable doing this, I'm out. Or by the time he starts saying, I don't want to be in this experiment anymore, he tells you, I don't want to do this anymore, then you stop. Or when he has already said all that, and then he stops responding entirely. you quit the experiment. That's 2, is that you quit the experiment when the guy asks you to quit the experiment, the learner. The third way to complete the experiment is to give all 3 450-volt shocks after getting 30 previous shocks to an unconscious person. That's the third way to do the experiment. And I'm kind of remembering things as I'm talking, so it's a little bit scattered. But one of the things, as you're shocking this person, if you say to the doctor, like, is he okay? The doctor's always going to say something like, there's no lasting damage, or he's fine. So the doctor will try and reassure you, but never does the doctor actually stop you from leaving the room. He will not touch you in any way. He just says, the learner is fine. You need to continue. It's important for the experiment that you continue. He'll say things like that. So at this point in a class, I ask the class a few things, which I'm now going to ask you, but since it's online, I'll just kind of walk through these questions here. So first of all, think to yourself, how many people, what percentage of people do you think will begin this experiment? Think to yourself. And usually when I ask that to the class, I get like numbers ranging from everybody to 75%. So I say, all right, let's assume like 90%. How many people do you think will still be in the experiment after he says ow the first time? And then think to yourself. But so like usually the class says something like, I don't know, like 75%. When he starts screaming the first time, what percentage of people do you think are still in the experiment, are still okay with shocking a screaming person? And that's when most people think it drops pretty low. So like, I don't know, 40% are still in the experiment. When he literally says, I don't want to be in this experiment anymore. So he says, I want to leave. What percentage do you think are still shocking a person who explicitly says, I don't want to be here anymore? And usually that's when the class says, like 5%, 1 in 20. And then what about when he's talking about his heart bothering him? And then when he has said, when he stops responding. So he, after complaining about his heart, screaming, saying, I don't want to be here anymore, he's now not responding. So he's dead or unconscious. What percentage do you think are still in the experiment? And the class usually says like, I don't know, 1%. And then what percentage actually complete the experiment, giving all 33, I guess, 450 volt shocks to an unconscious person. And in the 10 years of teaching this class, it usually is the case that we now get like virtually nobody, or less than 1% would be still in the experiment. Which is actually very consistent. When they proposed this experiment in the 1960s, before actually doing the experiment, they asked prominent psychologists, so we have this experiment we're going to do. What percentage of people do you think will go through with this? And psychologists, before knowing the results of this experiment, agreed with most of what my class says. And they said, well, it'll be less than 1% because we know about 0.5% of people are sadistic and or antisocial personality disorder, sociopaths basically. And so those would be the people that would carry it out that actually enjoy inflicting pain on somebody else. So it'll be less than 1%. So here comes the spoiler. I'm going to go ahead and spoil this for you before we watch the video, and then we'll watch the video because I think it's more shocking to go ahead and spoil it for you first. And that is that 2/3 of people give all 3 450 volt shocks to what they think is an unconscious person. So 2 out of every 3 people finish the experiment. Only 1 out of 3 people will stop the experiment, and everybody starts the experiment. With that being said, here we go. Here is there's actually a modern psychologist, Darren Brown, who in the UK redid this experiment, and this is his version. These are not actors, other than the 2 actors, but the actual subjects are not actors. These are actual people who are going through the actual same experiment. So here we go.